Hello class, hope everyone is doing well. Welcome back to another week of your favorite class, INST377. Alright, so this is probably my favorite lecture of the semester, being honest, right? Because this is the lecture where everything comes together, right? The next lecture we have is more optional. This one is kind of the last relevant lecture for the project. And so first, I want to preface by saying everything we're learning in this lecture has nothing to do with assignment 2. I'm being very abundantly clear. Nothing to do with assignment 2. Okay? Everything here applies to the project. Okay? Now, this is super exciting. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today is actually learning how to work with databases and how to deploy code, right? So this is really fun because what's going to happen is all these projects that you all are working on, which I'm really excited to see, you will actually be able to deploy it onto a real server and like actually interact with your application, which is so cool, right? So it's like a real website that people can go to, you can show off, and it's a lot of fun, right? And also, we're going to be learning how we can leverage everything we've done so far and interact with databases, right? Because obviously, databases are where data is stored, right? So it's very crucial, right? So this is the lecture where everything we've learned for this class actually comes together, right? So this is a really exciting lecture, right? So I'm really excited to kind of get started on this, and yeah, I think this is a lot of fun, and I think hopefully this will help you all learn a lot, and hopefully you'll be able to deploy some real code after this. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. And also, I want to preface by saying the timing of this is a little odd with Thanksgiving and everything. I would say that if you're watching this before like your assignment 2 is too far, it actually might be worth waiting a little bit, completing assignment 2 and then watching this, right? Because it'll just help you be more on track for the group project. So, just some advice. But anyway, if you want to watch it now, totally cool too. But anyway, all right, let's go ahead, get started. I'm really excited, and yeah, let's jump right in. All right. All right, so today we are talking about databases, deployments, and of course a little bit of JavaScript, because why not? Gotta do some JavaScript, right? So first, let's talk about a database. So most of you, I believe, have taken a database class, right? I believe that information studies curriculum in College Park um, teaches you like about databases, so I believe you should have enough. So what is a database, right? So a database is a way to store long-lived data, right? Pretty much as simple as that, right? Storing any kind of data, storing just like something, right? It just lives in a database, right? And the key thing that's really beneficial for databases is it's accessible from almost anywhere, right? Which is really nice. And the best part, especially for us, is it can be accessed programmatically in the code, right? So there's all these SDKs, APIs, everything which can actually help you access the database programmatically from the code, which is very useful. Now, I want to preface by saying this is not a database class. I am not here to teach you select star blah blah blah. You just need to be able to do some basic database operations, and that's it, right? I'm not asking you to do complex joins. I'm not asking you to do CTEs. All I'm asking you is to be able to select some data, and trust me, like there's pretty much examples on how to do it even on the website that we're going to be looking at, so it's really straightforward, right? Basically, all we're doing is simple operations in relations to the web apps we are building, right? So we will not be doing anything complex or fancy. We're not going to be out here doing like subqueries, CTEs, multi-table joins, nothing like that. If you want to, you're free to, but that's not the point of this class, right? Yeah, if you want to do that, I think there's a databases class that you could take to learn more about that. So, in terms of web development, right, the choice of database often can be very important. Like what database you use, right? There's a lot of databases going around. There are many types of databases and database options, right? So let's talk about some of them. So, for example, there's one called an in-memory database, right? There's a relational database, and there's also NoSQL databases, right? So in-memory databases are really cool, right? So those are basically like, for example, let's say you spin up a container, like a service, right? And part of that service has a database, right? Often this is used for like caching and other things. So there's like Redis and all these other kind of in-memory databases, they're super, super efficient, but they're not really great for long-term stores because as soon as the container restarts or something, it just loses the memory, right? So it's really great for caching. I'll tell you a fun story, right? When we first started doing the applications that we were working on, like we had to use the in-memory store because of how poor our database choice was. And man, that was fun to implement, but that was in Java. Fun times. Um, then there's relational. So relational databases are the standard of databases on the web, right? So 99% of use cases can be accommodated by a relational database, right? Even the biggest apps you know use a relational database, right? This is basically your standard, like doing joins, etc., right? And then there is a new wave of databases called NoSQL, right? And these are these non-relational databases where everything is kind of flat, right? And there's a lot of great competitors in this space. Mongo, for example, started off as one. DynamoDB from AWS, ClickHouse. There's a lot of really good options. But I will say in most cases it's overkill. When you start an app, you should always start with relational and then start working your way out, right? Because most of the time, 99.9999% of the time, you only need relational. And then if you start needing other things, then you start evaluating, right? Our app made a mistake of going non-relational first, and then we regretted that, and now we're going back to relational. So, yeah. So, for the purposes of this class, we're going to use a relational database for which we can create a free account for training purposes. So that's what we're going to do, right? So the platform we're using is called Supabase, right? Now, why not the others, right? In-memory is a good solution, but we're not trying to deploy our app. And to deploy our app to some platforms, they don't actually support in-memory, right? There's a lot of great in-memory options like SQL, I forget what it's called, SQL... I forget. There's a good SQL option for in-memory, right? But Supabase is a really, really popular platform, and I'll talk about it in a second. It is really good, and it's going to work really well for our use case, right? And non-relational in general is overkill for the needs of this class. Okay, so let's talk about Supabase, right? Sounds kind of cool. Supabase, right? So Supabase is actually an open source Firebase alternative. I'm sure some of you might have heard of Firebase, and maybe even some of you have used Firebase. Well, Firebase has had a lot of problems, right? A lot of costs, right? So Supabase has been starting to do a lot of things. And Supabase has really risen in the indie development tech stack, right? It's one of the top choices for a database. They also do authentication. They do a lot of things. And it's all open source, which means it's all free, basically, right? Obviously, they have paid plans and stuff, but all of there is basically like an open source alternative to these, so you don't have to be stuck with Firebase, right? There's also some other great database solutions. PlanetScale's another one, but they cost money, right? Then there used to be one called Neon. Neon was very, very popular because it was serverless, so you wouldn't have to manage anything. But the problem is it got acquired by Databricks, actually. So I was at the conference when they announced it. That was pretty cool, actually. But they acquired Neon, so that's pretty interesting. But for the purposes of this class, we're going to be using Supabase's Postgres database, which is quite generous with its free tier and super easy to connect. And this will allow us to create tables and maintain a live DB for free for this class. Now, there are many alternatives, right? Vercel Postgres, right? It's actually interesting. When I wrote this used to be an option, but now I think Vercel actually ended their Postgres, and we'll talk about Vercel in a bit. But Vercel Postgres is an option, Firebase is an option, but truthfully, they just aren't as simple, right? They're just not as easy to interact with. Supabase is a great way to learn how we use SDKs, how we leverage databases, and how we actually deploy it. So it's a really good option. So for this, let's go ahead and just start creating an account, right? So we'll create an account on Supabase. This is completely free, and you can sign up with the same GitHub you use for this class. And then we're going to install it in JavaScript. So we just have to go and install it, right? So with that, let's go ahead, hop on over and start creating an account. All right, so this is Supabase. Super cool, right? So Supabase is very simple, right? As you can see, they have all these very cool things that they offer. Database, authentication, whatever, right? For us, the only one that matters is this. They have a cool animation, apparently. And as you can see, you can use it with any framework, including Next.js, right? Or JavaScript. So very cool. So go ahead, log in, sign up. What it might tell you to do is create an organization. I already have an organization, so I'm good, but go ahead, create one completely free. Now, once you're here, go ahead and let's create a new project, okay? And let's call this project customer, okay? And here it's going to ask for a database password. So I'm going to go ahead and generate a password, right? Make sure to keep that somewhere, right? Yeah, just keep it somewhere. And here, just choose a region, right? I do U.S. North Virginia. That's probably the best one. And perfect, cool. And everything else can be the same. And let's go ahead and click Create New Project. Okay. Now, once this is done, it's pretty cool, right? So nice. Now we have a database. Pretty sick, right? So now what we can do is explore a little bit, and here you can see on the left all the kind of options, right? So what we're going to do is go into the table editor, right? And from here, we're going to go ahead and click New Table, okay? Now here, you're going to start creating the table. So here for us, let's go ahead and create a table called customer, right? So maybe we want to store customer name, right? Now, there's some interesting points here that are kind of interesting. So if you look here, right, the first thing you'll see is this option that's auto-enabled called Enable Row Level Security. What is that, right? So row level security is a really great tool which helps you segregate your data programmatically for your tenants or for multiple customers, right? And this is very beneficial for SaaS apps, right? So Supabase is very catered towards SaaS apps, and hence why they have it out of the box, right? For us, obviously that doesn't matter, but if, for example, you were having a SaaS app, RLS would allow you, row level security is what it's called, allow you to say, hey, if tenant ID equals A, even if they try querying data for tenant ID B, it just won't work, right? So it creates a hard layer, right? That makes it very like security resistant, right? Or security, good for security, I guess is the right way to format it, right? And if you ever get a SOC 2 audit or anything, it's mandatory, so good to know. But what you're going to do is go ahead and uncheck this. This is absolutely not necessary, and if you do use it, it will not work, so please uncheck it, okay? And then from here, there's some other things, right? So here are the columns, so you can see ID, it's an integer, right? And it's the primary key, right? And it's a default value. And also, I think if we click settings, it says is identity. And what this means is that it'll automatically assign a sequential unique number to the column, right? So that's great. Now, on top of that, we can go ahead and see there's a created at, and by default, it's now. So you don't have to insert that data. It just does it for you, right? And it's a timestamp. So now let's go ahead and create some other data. So I'm going to create one called customer first name, right? And it's going to be a, let's see, there should be a text text or varchar. I'll do varchar, and I'll say it's nothing else. And then let's do customer last name. Last name. Did I spell that right? Yeah, last name. Okay, and again, choose varchar. And then lastly, let's do customer state. And again, do varchar here. Okay, cool. And so you could also have like not null columns, right? So for example, we could say, hey, this one, it has to be nullable, like meaning that someone has to insert a first name and someone has to insert a state, right? I'm going to keep state nullable, but just as an example, right? And then from here, you could add more columns, you could add foreign keys, whatever it is, right? It's just good to know, but there's all these things you can do, right? Super cool, right? Now from here, all you do, really easy, is you just go ahead and click save. And would you look at that? We have a table. That's pretty cool, right? So as you can see, now we have a table, right? So what we can do here, and you can see here it says RLS disabled, right? But here we can actually go and insert data, right? So let's say we click insert and click insert row, right? So here we can say created at default now, customer first name, let's say Anmol, last name dash, state MD, right? And click save. And look at that. ID created at first name, last name, state. Pretty nice, right? And you can go ahead, add more data. Cool. Okay. So what's interesting is this kind of is really half the battle, right? We've created the database. It's accessible. Great. But now the hard part is how do we get our code to interact with this data? Obviously, right? Because if we look at it, right, it's great that we have this database, but obviously we need to interact with it somehow so our code can actually work, right? Which is very important. So here there's a button at the top that says connect, right? And this basically gives you a way to connect to your database, right? So if you look here, they give different types of options. So for example, there should be a Node.js option here, right? And you can see it says, hey, you can use something called a connection string and connect, right? So you could use Postgres, right? And connect to your database. Or you can use a app framework. So for example, Next.js with Supabase.js SDK. And I would go ahead and copy this just because we might need it later, but yeah, super easy, right? And you could do everything, right? I think even, yeah, you can do everything from here. And there's mobile frameworks, ORMs, MCPs, all these super cool and easy things you can do, right? And you can connect, right? Now, for us, right, the best way to connect to Supabase is using the good old Supabase SDK. So that just makes it so much easier to connect, right? So how do we, let's take a look at how that looks, right? So at the left here, if you go down, there's an API docs section. So go ahead and click that, right? And so here it'll say, cool, this is our Supabase SDK, right? This is how we actually go and look at that Supabase client, right? And so here you can see there's an introduction for tables and views, and it actually tells you how to kind of do different things. So select ID, right? Select created at with pagination, right? It even says update insert rows, right? It gives you an example of how to insert a row, right? It's super easy, right? But all of this relies on one thing, right? It relies on this client library, Supabase JS, which is the Supabase SDK, right? So we talked a lot about this last time, right? So for example, NodeMon was a library we used. So just like that, Supabase has its own library, which makes it very easy to work with Supabase, right? And so this is the best way to connect to Supabase, and that's what we're going to do. So, all right, now let's go ahead and hop on over to VS Code, and we're going to actually start using this and see how this works, right? We're going to build some APIs, we're going to connect to the database, and it's going to be a lot of fun. All right, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so now we are in your favorite app, I'm sure, VS Code. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. So what we're going to do is go ahead in week 12, go ahead and create a new folder. Let's call it Supabase sample app. And okay, perfect. All right, looking good, right? And let's go ahead, right click and click open in terminal, right? So that we can go ahead and start getting this set up. So from here, we're going to go ahead and start doing some stuff we learned from last week. So we'll do an npm init, right? And we can see here the package name is already installed. Great version, great description, who cares? Entry point. So entry point in this case can be index.js, that's fine. Test command is fine, git repository is fine, keyword is fine, author can be yourself, in my case myself, okay? And ISC license is fine, and the type is fine, okay? Is that okay with me? Yes, it is, okay? All right, perfect. So it looks good, looks like it's working. All right, perfect. And so we'll open this up. Cool. Our package.json got created, right? Now, obviously, the first thing we need to do is install NodeMon, right? And Express, right? Because we're going to use those. So let's go ahead, type npm install NodeMon, right? And let's wait for that to finish, right? Should only take maybe a fraction of a second here. Great, and do npm install express as well, right? Easy, great. Okay, cool. So we have our two things, right? Now let's go ahead and just set up the basic, file structure. So let's go ahead, open up in a new index.js file within that folder. And go ahead and just set up the standard express, right? So we'll do a const express equals require express, right? Nice and simple, right? And all we got to do is do const app equals express, right? Oh, parentheses, not what I wanted. I don't know what I just clicked, but okay. Whoa. Okay, cool. And then const port equals 3000. 3000. Yep. And then all we'll do is set up our basic app.listen. So app.listen, and we'll do a port, comma, parentheses equal, and here we go, do console.log. App is available on port, and do comma port, right? Cool, nice and easy, right? And also, let's not forget, we should always set up nodemon. So let's go to our package.json, right? We can see our express and nodemon got installed, and we will also set up a start script, and that will be to nodemon -e and single quotes asterisk single quotes. Okay, close that out. Perfect. Easy as that. Okay, so let's go ahead, just do an npm start, make sure our code works as expected, make sure it's all good to go, and then we'll start building from there. Okay, looks good. App is ready, app is glowing. Okay, perfect. Now let's go ahead and just start building some stuff. So let's say, for example, we wanted to build something to say, hey, I want to go and add customers, right? Right. That sounds pretty easy, right? I have this database. I want to go and add customers to it, right? So how do I do that? So first thing I'll do is I'll go ahead here and we'll create an app.post, right? So posts are for adding typically, and we'll do /customer. Okay. And here we'll do a rec comma res, right? And here we'll do console.log adding customer, right? And also what we'll do is we'll log out the request, right? Because we want to make sure that the data coming in is good. So request comma rec. Perfect. Cool. So perfect. We have this working, and what we'll do is an npm start here. Okay, and looking good. So now let's go ahead and see what happens. So let's go ahead and try adding a customer. So let's go ahead, open up Insomnia here, and use local scratch, that is fine. And here we'll do a new request, and we'll do /customer. And here we'll add a body. So what kind of data would we want? So obviously we want the first name, right? Oh my gosh, what was this? Sorry, Insomnia just went completely crazy on me. Give me a second. Okay. Yep. First name, colon, comma, last name, right? Colon. I'll do this later. Dash. And then state, colon, MD. I forgot something. Okay, perfect. All right, so now let's go ahead and post. So this is a post to this customer. Click send. First of all, nothing's going to happen, right? Because we didn't do a res.end or anything like that. So let's go ahead and see here what's happening. So the first thing you'll see is, hey, like there's a lot of gibberish coming up. Like I see that adding customer, and then it says request incoming message, right? And you're just like, but that doesn't make any sense. What is that actually doing, right? Like I can't, like, how do I know what the user sent, right? Because like typically I would send something in the JSON. Well, it's a great question. So the problem is Express natively does not support reading requests, at least easily, right? So what we have to do is we actually have to use another library to help us decode those requests and then leverage them, right? So there's this library called body parser. So let's look up body parser. Okay. And you can see it's actually a middleware for Node.js and Express that parses incoming request bodies. And so what you can see is actually it's a very common topic, right? So it's a body parser, and we can just look it up on npm actually. And here we go. So this is basically parse incoming request bodies in a middleware before your handlers, available using request.body, right? And so this is really important. And all we have to do is do npm install body parser. Okay, so let's go ahead and go here and close this out and do a npm install body parser. Okay, cool, right? Now how do we use it, right? That's pretty easy. Seems easy enough, right? So it's really simple to use. So all we do at the top here is what we're going to do is do const body parser equals require and do body parser. Okay, easy enough. And then all we have to do here is do app.use body body parser.json. Cool. And then it's really easy. Now all you do in the console.log is change it to request.body. Okay, and that's it. Now your request is available, and we'll test this. And also I want to make sure that the data actually this ends, so just do a res.send and just do request.body, so it sends back exactly what the user inputted, right? Just so it doesn't crash the app. So there you go. Now let's do an npm start again. Cool. And go to Insomnia and send. And look at that. That's pretty cool. So now you can see, look at that request, and you see the exact data, right? So this is the first step. This is really crucial, right? Because this is really nice, right? Because now what we can see here is we can take the data from a request, and then now maybe we can pass this into Supabase somehow, right? And now that's kind of the hard part, which we have to figure out, right? So we have to figure out how to do that, right? And we will, don't worry. But that's step one, right? So we figured out step one here. Okay, so super easy. Now, how do we actually use Supabase, right? We want to add this customer into Supabase, right? So how do we do that? So let's go ahead, shut down my npm, right? And what we're going to do first is install the Supabase SDK, Supabase JS SDK. Right? So let's go here. Here you can see you run this npm install command. So let's go ahead, copy that, and run it. Okay, so we're going to run that. Okay. And so now what you'll see in your package JSON, you'll see a Supabase-JS. Super cool, right? Pretty easy, right? That works just as I expected, right? So nice and easy, works. Okay. Now, how do we actually leverage this API, this kind of thing, right? So what we're going to do first is initialize the Supabase client. So how do we do that? So what we do is we do const Supabase client equal to require, and here we'll do at Supabase /Supabase-JS. Okay, and then from there, all we're going to do is now actually initialize or create the client. Okay, so how do we do that? So how we do that here, we can do, let's add a comment, initialize Supabase client, right? And here we can do const Supabase URL equals, right? And also const Supabase key equals. Okay, now these are very important. Now where do we actually get these from? So if we go here, right, you're going to see that you're going to need to actually get these URLs and keys from somewhere. So if you go back to your database, we should be able to pull this data and click let's see, connect, I believe, and go to app frameworks, right? So here you go. There's a Supabase URL and a key. Okay, please don't steal my key. I would greatly appreciate that. So you add your Supabase URL and you add your Supabase key here. Okay, and just go ahead and copy those. Perfect. Okay, And there we go. And now all we have to do from here is add one more thing, and we're going to create a const supabase, okay? And that's going to be equal to supabase client dot create client supabase URL, comma, supabase key. There we go. Easy as that. So now, this is kind of exciting. Well, we can actually connect to Supabase, right? This is pretty cool, right? So now, how do we actually leverage this? So first thing we're going to do is let's start really basic. Let's go ahead and just be able to list what exists in the database. So how do we do that? So what we can do is we can create an app.get, right? And it can be /customers, plural, right? And it'll take in a rec, comma res, right? And from there, it will console.log, console.log, attempting to get all customers. Okay, there you go. Cool. Now, how do we actually do anything with this, right? This obviously has something, right? So what we can do is actually, to leverage the Supabase SDK, is first thing we need to do is make this an async API, right? And you might ask why. Well, let me show you. So let's do a Supabase, right? Dot from, right? And say from customer, right? Dot select. Okay. Now, the problem with this is actually, if you look at this, right, the supabase.from, and let's see if we can do a return here, right? So this is actually an asynchronous client, okay? And I know that because I've worked with this quite a bit, but this is actually an asynchronous client. So what we have to do is we have to do await, right? And make this async here, async, okay? And now what's interesting about this is actually, if we go and look at the docs, this is actually going to be a great place to use the docs. So let's go here and go to API docs from our table, right? And go to customer, right? You'll see here, they do a await supabase dot from customer, right? And that's all we need to do. But the other thing you'll see is they do let, and they do this kind of weird thing with curly braces, right? So what is that? So let's go ahead and do this first. So await supabase dot from customer, and we have to create a const data, comma, error equals. All right, perfect. Look at that. So what is this saying, right? This is really interesting code, but what is this actually saying? So it's a good question. So what this is doing is in JavaScript, right? You can create a const, and then you can use these like brackets. And this brackets means that there's multiple variables coming from this Supabase client, right? So there's a data variable and an error variable. And you'll see this is a very common, but again, varies based on the SDK you're using. So what this is saying is that if there's an error, it'll show up with this error variable. And if there's data, it'll show up here, right? So now both of these variables are available for you to use as a user, right? So now what we can do is do something really simple. So let's say, right, is we say if error, right? Then we can do console.log, right? And we'll do error, colon, $, error, right? And then we'll do res.statuscode equals 500. So 500 stands for internal server error, right? And then do a res.send error. Okay? Error. Okay? And then all we have to do is say, hey, else, and we can just do else res.send data. Easy enough, right? So let's go ahead and experiment what happens now. So this is pretty cool, right? So let's go ahead, do an npm start, make sure everything works as expected. Okay, looking good. And go into Insomnia, and here make this a get, right? And here go to customers, make sure there's no body. Okay, so we'll go ahead and click send, and we'll see something. Okay, now look at that. So now you can see, oh wow, look at this. This is the customer I added. Cool. I see all the data for it. Perfectly usable, right? Now let's go ahead and see what might happen if we cause an error. So how can we cause an error? Let's go ahead and I'm just going to do something dumb. I'm going to call this customers, plural, like that's not a real table, right? And let's see what happens. So now, one thing to note is since it was a success, you see a 200. 200 means okay, right? Now this should fail. So let's click send and look at that. 500 internal server error, and this is code, blah, blah, blah. Perhaps you meant blah, 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 right? So look at that. So this is pretty cool, right? So now we are fully able to integrate with the database, query from it, and be able to pull their data, right? So now let's take this a step further. So now let's say, hey, you know, like this is great, but now what if I want to add data, right? Right? I want to add a customer, right? So how do we do that, right? So that's pretty cool. So what we can do is we can take this, right? And here we will go up, and what we're going to do is build some logic. So first thing we're going to do is first say, hey, what data are we getting from the customer? So we're getting a first name, last name, state, right? So we're going to do const first name equals rec.body.first name, right? And then const last name equals rec.body.last name, right? And then const state equals rec.body.state. Okay, easy enough. So now all we have to do is say, hey, you know, like we have to just basically add it to Supabase, right? So how do we do that? Well, if we go back to the Supabase docs, right, and look a little bit here, it says, okay, here's how you insert a row, right? And so what we can do is basically follow this logic. So all we have to do is go back to VS Code, right? And what we have to do is, again, this has to become an async because Supabase is inherently asynchronous. And here we have to do a we have to do a const data comma error, just like we were doing before, equal to await Supabase, right, dot from customer, okay, in single quotes, okay. But now we have to add a dot insert, okay. Now, let's talk about what this insert is. So this insert basically says, hey, what values are you trying to insert, right? So the first thing you're going to do is on the left-hand side, you're going to put the column in the database. So if you remember, the column in the database is customer underscore first underscore name, right? And here it correlates to first name, right? And then the same for last name, customer underscore last underscore name colon last name, and then customer underscore state colon state, okay. And then here what we're going to do is do dot select, okay, cool. So this is pretty cool, right? So now theoretically, if this all works, this is going to send some data, right? So, of course, let's add some error handling, right? Let's copy actually this exact logic here, right? So if error, blah, 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 otherwise send data, right? Okay, perfect, right? So if error, tell me there, else send the data. Cool. So now let's go back here and let's create the post. So we're going to, actually, let's create a new request here. Request, and let's call it a post, and it'll go to localhost 3000/customer, and let's add a JSON body here, right? And this is going to go ahead and we're going to add a first name colon maybe Jane, last name Smith, right? And we're going to say state, maybe what do we want? Wyoming, maybe? Sure, why not, right? And let's go ahead and click send. Well, would you look at that? So this is pretty cool. So we added this, and now if we look here, Jane Smith has an ID created at, and the data is there. So now if we go into Supabase and go to that table, right? Look at that. That is so cool, right? So our data is interactable with our app. This is so cool, right? This is so amazing, right? So this is really cool, right? Now let's also go back to our get customers and run it and see what happens. Look at that. We can see both our customers. That is so cool, right? Now, there's still some problems here that, we need to deal with, right? So for example, let's say instead of doing Jane Smith, right? What if I forgot the last name, right? And what if I forgot the state, right? What if I just put Jane in this? It works. Unfortunate, right? Or what if I, instead of this, put Jane Smith, right? But instead of putting Wyoming with two things, I put Wyoming, like the word, right? Send. It's not perfect, right? We need to figure out a way to solve that, right? Because that's not perfect. Well, so how could we solve this? Well, the first piece, right, of having a mandatory blah blah, like, of this and whatever, that's solvable, right? We can just say, hey, if last name, so we can say if first name uh equals uh empty, right? Then return an error, right? Easy problem. But what about the state, right? How do we do that? You want me to type if state equals a blah blah blah? That's very hard to do. So what we can do is we can actually use more libraries. And see, this is one of the benefits of libraries, right? It lets us go and just kind of build out cool logic, right? So let's go ahead and take a look. So there's this library called body parser. So, state abbreviation. So there's one called USA state validator. And we can look up JS and look at that. A tool to determine whether a given input is a valid name or abbreviation of a US state. Isn't that sick? So it can say, hey, if it is a valid state input, yeah. It can even say if it's a valid state abbreviation, right? So Ohio would be false, but OH would be true, right? It's pretty cool, right? So, yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff we can do. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this. So let's go ahead and install this. So let's go back here, close this, and run this. npm I USA state validator. Nice. Now, using it is really easy. All we do at the top of our code is we type const is valid state abbreviation, and this is case sensitive. This does matter, okay? Equals require a USA state validator. Okay, that's it. Okay, so now all we have to do is really cool. All we do is say, hey, if not is valid state abbreviation state, right? And then we just say console.error, right? We need to inform ourselves state : $state is invalid. Okay, and then what we can do is do a res.statuscode equal to 400, right? Because this is user error, so it's a 400 bad request, right? And then all we do is we say res.send, right? And we send an error. So what we can do is we can create a const error JSON, maybe error JSON equal to message : $state is not a valid two-letter state abbreviation, right? Abbreviation, right? And then res.send JSON.stringify error JSON, right? And also we have to make sure that we send it as an application JSON just to make it easier. So do a res.header and do content-type, comma, application/JSON. Okay, this just makes sure that the parser understands that we're sending a JSON. So, cool. All right, and that's it. Okay, so let's go ahead, and here what we're going to do is go back, do an npm start. Okay, and we're going to go here, go to Insomnia, and we're going to try Wyoming again and see what happens. Oh, Wyoming is, I don't know, well, I can't spell, but Wyoming is not a valid 2-letter state. And you can keep trying, and we can see how it works. Oh, okay, so we have a problem. This is interesting, right? So look at this. There's a lot of Wyomings, and you might be like, what's going on? What did I do? What mistake did you make, Professor? I made a dumb mistake. That's the truth, okay? So this is really interesting, right? So what's happening is here, you're sending the response, but remember, the method is still working, right? Because res.send does not exit you out of the method. All it does is it sends a response to the API. So what you need to do is you need to type return. So that leaves the method, right? And actually, it's interesting because anytime we have an error, we should be doing that as well. So we should do a return like that, right? Same here, return, okay? So this is really interesting, right? So this, right, is what's causing issues. So now let's go ahead and instead of Wyoming, let's say Alabama, just some other state. So Alabama, right? But now let's go ahead and click send. Look at that. There's no Alabama, right? It worked, right? No issue, right? So this is really interesting. But now look at that. Wow, that's pretty cool. So now let's do AL, which is also Alabama, and say, look at that. That's so cool, guys, right? So look at this. So now we have a fully working app that actually validates states, saves it in a database. We get it from the database. This is so cool, right? But here's the fun part. We're just getting started. There's so much more to do. Okay, so this is part one. So Supabase installed, great. Now let's go ahead and take this a bit further. So we have all this cool code. It's working, nice. But now let's take this a bit further. So first things first, we talked about the Supabase SDK. I'm not going to go over it again, right? We talked about how we get data, insert data, everything. But now this is super exciting. So now we're going to talk about deploying apps. So after we've built out these apps, it's so important that not only do we use it locally, but we also deploy them for the rest of the world. This used to be something that used to be very difficult, very expensive. There would be lots of costs. But with the rise of serverless, this has become extremely easy, cheap, free in fact, and super quick. Companies like Supabase and Vercel offer really great options. Now we're going to be using Vercel for this class, so because Supabase's offering isn't that great, in my opinion, but Vercel is amazing. And let me tell you, right, this might be dating myself, but there used to be a time when there was this company like called HostGator and all these things. Maybe, I don't know if any of you have seen ads for them, but I used to remember that I would pay $200 something for 3 years of web hosting, right? Not including the domain, just for hosting a website. I used to pay for that, right? And nowadays, like I have 2 sites, they're free. Just free, right? I just pay for the domain, and that's even optional, right? It's crazy to think about, but they're completely free because of companies like Vercel, Supabase. These things are just cheap. You don't need to you don't need to worry about paying an arm and a leg and an investment, right? It used to be really hard, but nowadays it's just so cool. It's so like affordable, right? And it's so fast, right? It's created this big revolution where I remember like you'd have to go in, set up like a WordPress or an SFTP server and all these things. Now all you do is you deploy your code, put it on Git, and it automatically deploys. It's magic, right? So the time of web development has gone down so much, right? Because it's just so much easier to do these things, right? There used to be a time where it used to be really complicated, really hard, really slow, but now it's really, really easy, right? So first, let's talk about Vercel, right? So Vercel is a tool that makes deployments super, super easy, right? It's free and allows you to deploy full stack JavaScript apps with ease. In fact, I use it for my own personal website, right? Vercel is really simple to set up, right? It offers its own DB solution, but it's not as easy to set up as Supabase, so we're not going to use it. But all it requires is a GitHub repository and a vercel.json file. And that's it. And it works with Express.js, right? So the Vercel JSON file is very simple. I'm going to provide it to you, right? It basically indicates what is the file that'll be the source of the deployment, and that's it, right? Now, one thing for Vercel. So Vercel, you have to create your own GitHub repo, right? We cannot use the shared class one, right? That's just because of how Vercel works. Outside of that, our code should work mostly as expected, right? And for the project, you're going to be hosting your app on Vercel publicly, right? which is really exciting, right? So you're going to actually deploy your code to the web and it's going to be available for everyone to see, right? So super simple. All right, so let's go ahead, hop on over to Vercel, and we're going to get started. All right, so here we are in Vercel. Okay, so I already went ahead, created an account. Go ahead, create your own account, and once you're in, this is the exciting part, right? So Vercel allows us to basically go ahead and deploy our code to the real web, which is super exciting, right? So how are we going to do this? So once we're in Vercel, all we have to do, click Add New here, right? And we'll click Project, right? And it'll say, hey, do you want to add a new Git repository, right? And you can see it'll say, oh, can we import one, etc., right? And that's exactly what we're going to do. So what I'm going to tell you to do first is go to github.com, right? So go to github.com, log in with your account. All right, so once you're in GitHub, go ahead, create a new repository, and you can call it whatever you want. I will do INST377-week 12-sample app-FA25. And the one thing you should do is make this repo private, right? Otherwise your code will be exposed. We don't want that, right? If we commit something sensitive, etc., right? But for the project, you need to make it public, right? Actually, now that I think about it, I'll be able to share this with you all, so I'm going to keep it public. Up to you if you want to. And go ahead and add a README, right? Just so there's something in the file so we can clone it. And go ahead and create that repository. So now this repository will be available for us to go and deploy into Vercel, which is super, super cool, right? So now all we have to do, go back to Vercel, and you'll see that, oh, my app just showed up. Pretty cool, right? So what we can do is just go ahead and click import, and you'll see it'll tell you, hey, what kind of project is this, etc., right? Because it wants to understand what kind of project this is so that it can understand, okay, how to actually deploy it, right? So how do we do that? So here the framework preset is other, so we can take a look here. For us, other is going to be fine, so let's keep I see express as an option nowadays. It actually didn't used to be, but we can keep it other. That's fine. And all we have to do is actually I have a better idea. So what we're going to do, go back to Git and make sure to clone this repo. So we're going to go ahead, clone this repo, and let's clone this repo. So all we have to do here is do a cd desktop workspace git clone. Okay, cool. And then we should go into that repo, right? So I'm just going to open it up. So it's called FA25, right? And I'm going to open that up in VS Code. Great. And now we can start working on it, right? So now what we're going to do is basically do exactly what we did for our Supabase app, but instead we're going to deploy it, which is really exciting because everything we just did will now be available on a real website, right? Which is super cool, actually, right? So how do we do this? Well, what we can do is, again, we're going to have to set up an npm init, right? So open up a new terminal here, right? And we can do a simple npm init, right? And, set up our package name, version, description. We can say INST7 week 12 sample app. Okay. Entry point, we can keep it index.js, test command, git repo, keywords doesn't matter, author, put yourself, and license cool, type, that's fine, and say yes. Perfect. So now we have our package.json and it all looks good, right? Obviously what we should do is install all the things we had to install before. So let's do an npm install. And what you can do actually is you can do with a space to specify multiple packages. So we can say body parser, right? Express, nodemon, and USA state validator. Okay. And it'll go ahead and install all these packages so that it's available. Amazing. Cool. And so let's go ahead and copy the index.js from our previous thing and leverage it, right? So all we're going to do is go ahead and come back here and copy our Supabase sample app, copy its index.js, and paste it into our week 12. Okay, looks great. Okay, cool. And All right, looks pretty good. Now, before you commit this code, there's one very crucial thing. So this code is public, so I cannot commit my Supabase URL and key, right? Otherwise, anyone in the world can use that, right? So what we're going to do is create an environment file, right? And that environment file will allow us to actually like hide the code, right? And we can in Vercel also define that environment so that we don't expose our stuff to the world. So what we're going to do is create a new file, call it .env, and also a new file called .getignore, right? And in that .getignore, we're going to add a .env, right? So that basically means that this .env won't be committed, right? Otherwise, that's very dangerous. Okay. So now what we're going to do is create two variables called Supabase, Supabase underscore URL and equals, and then Supabase underscore key equals. Okay. And we're going to copy those from here. So I'm going to copy this, and we don't need quotes or anything in the env, just need to take the data as it is. Okay, perfect. Now, environment variables basically allow us to, across environments, change variables. So what this is really beneficial for is, for example, let's say you have something in QA versus someone in prod, right? You're going to have different Supabase URLs, right? Because there's different environments, etc. And also it makes sure that these are secret and don't get committed to your proper code base, right? So in JavaScript, to be able to use these environment variables, you actually have to use something else called .env JavaScript, right? So here you go. So look at this. .env is a zero dependency module that loads environment variables from a .env file. So it's really important. So we're also going to go ahead and install .env. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, perfect. And now all we have to do, which is really cool, is go to our index.js, and at the top here, we're going to do const.env equals require .env. Okay. And then from there, here we're going to use .env.config. Okay, just like that. Perfect. And now what's really cool is all we have to do is say, hey, instead of using this Supabase URL, go to process.env .supabase underscore URL. Okay. And then the same for the Supabase key. Okay. So process.env.supabase underscore key. Perfect. All right, so now let's go ahead and test our code really quick, right? So we'll go ahead. Oh, I forgot to set up a start script. So let's go ahead and set that up. Set up a start node mon -e asterisk, close asterisk, and comma. Perfect. Let's go ahead and test this really quick. Okay, looking good. Okay. Clean exit, waiting for changes before restart. Why? Looks like something happened. 1 second. All right, sorry about that. I just realized I was running the Supabase app still, so it kept crashing. So if you do that, make sure to fix that as well. All right, so go ahead, do an npm start, and cool. All right, looks like everything's up. So let's just verify that the env variables are being picked up properly. So to do that, let's go to Insomnia, just do a get request, make sure that everything is looking good. Nice. Okay, cool. So the database connection is working. Looks great. I mean, everything seems to be coming in as expected, and this is great news. Great news. Okay, so now this is really fun. So now what we can do is actually commit this code, and hopefully, if we deploy this code, we'll be able to hit our API that is actually deployed, which is really exciting, right? So before we do that, make sure your git ignore is updated with .env. Make sure your env has these two variables, right? And make sure you've switched this over, right? Before you commit your code as a warning. So now go ahead, commit your code, right? So git status, git add dot, git commit -m, and we can say feat adding initial API, right? And git push. Okay. So perfect. So now your code is pushed. So now if you go to Git, right, you should see all your code looks great. And now what we can do is go back to Vercel, import that project, and it'll say everything, let it do that. Now here, where it says environment variables, make sure to import the .env, right? So, or paste the .env. So what you can actually do is just go to VS Code, go to your .env, Command A, Command C, Control A, Control C for Windows, and then just copy paste it. And there we go. And now with that, go ahead and deploy. Okay. And if all our hard work paid off and we are lucky, this will deploy and our app will actually be hosted on the internet, which is super, super exciting. So let's go ahead and see. All right. So it says you just deployed a new project. Let's go to continue to dashboard. Looks good. All right, let's go to the app. Huh. That is honestly not what I expected. Okay. So I made one very, very big mistake. So I forgot one file, which we talked about in the lecture, and that's called the vercel.json, right? So luckily, you don't have to remember what that is, but you have to make sure to include it. So right click here, new file, and vercel.json, right? And you can paste this code in. Now, one thing I want to note, when you deploy to Vercel, it has to be index.js. I don't know why. It just has to be. So just keep that in mind, okay? So go ahead, add your vercel.json. I'll do commit -m chore adding vercel JSON and git push. Okay, and the great thing about Vercel is as soon as you push something, you'll see it'll start showing up. So let's see if you refresh here. It'll probably take a second. There you go. Building chore adding Vercel JSON. So now it's probably going to take a second. Let's see how long it takes. Oh, there it is. And if I'm right, all right, there we go. Cool. So this might not look like much, but if at the top here you do /customers, super exciting. Look at that. Our API is working and it is actually deployed, right? So you can take this domain that was generated for you, go to Insomnia and switch your request right here to this and it'll work. Isn't that so cool, right? This is amazing, right? This is actually like our real website, right? So you could host actually something and it would work. This is super exciting, right? We're able to actually see the data we're generating and we're actually able to leverage it. So now let's take this a step further, right? So we have all this great code, but what if we want to actually visualize it, right? Like obviously it's great we have this, but we want to take this step further, obviously, right? So how do we do that? Well, what if we actually deploy HTML and CSS and make this a full stack app, which is super exciting. So how do we do that? Well, let's go ahead and do it, right? So first thing we're going to do, if you remember from last class, we had to create a folder called public, right? And in Express, right, what we had to do is create or basically use this like a little bit of code here. So we had to do an app.use and it had to be express.static, right? And then do __ name, right? Plus /public. Okay, perfect. And remember, it has to be public, all lowercase, right? Very important, right? All right, so super cool. So now what we can do is we can actually make so first thing I'm going to do is, since we're testing, I'm going to make an npm start, right? Because since we're testing this locally, I want to see the changes as they happen, right? So now what we're going to do is go to our public and create a HTML file, right? So let's just call it customers.html, right? So very nice, very simple, you know. We just want something simple, and we'll create a nice HTML page here, right? And we'll add a head, and it'll have a title called Our Customers, right? Perfect. And then, of course, we'll also create a customers.javascript, right? So we'll do a customers.js, right? So in the HTML, we'll reference that script, and we'll say source equals customers.js and do a defer. Perfect. Looking good. All right. So now, how do we actually want to do this? Well, let's think about what we want to do. So when I think about what I want to do, I want to be able to actually see all our customers, of course, right? That to me is the most obvious thing that I want to do, right? So how do we do that, right? I mean, I just want to go ahead and see our customers, right? So, well, let's think about this, right? So let's say we have all our customers, they come in a JSON. Well, could we not just, create a table with that data and then show it? I think we could. So let's go ahead and do exactly that, right? So let's go ahead and create a function, async function called load customer data. Okay. And right now we'll do that, and then make sure that we have a window.onload equals load customer data. Perfect. Okay, so now how are we going to get this data, right? So we know that if we do an await fetch, right, and we go to http:// localhost 3000/customers, that should load our data, right? So let's go ahead and then log out that result. So then result, it'll be result.json. Okay, and then do a dot then, and then do result.json, and let's do a console.log result.json. Perfect. So now let's go to our browser and go to localhost 3000, right? Because remember, we're testing this locally before we deploy, right? So let's go to localhost 3000. Okay. Oh, I spelled it wrong. Give me a second. Localhost. Okay, so it's not loading, right? And interestingly, the message says cannot get slash. So if you recall, there's one thing we're missing here, right? In our index.js, we forgot to actually say, hey, if you try hitting the slash, go to that page. So what we need to do is do app.get, right? And then do a slash, right? And then have a rec, res, right? And then here, have a res dot send file, and here you're going to put public slash customers.html and comma root :__ dir name. Okay, great. So now if we go back here, refresh, all right, I'm seeing something, and if you see here it says our customer, so that means it is now loading. Cool, that's super exciting. So now let's go to our inspect and see what we're seeing in our console, right? And okay, would you look at that? I'm seeing our data. So that's really good. That means we're able to hit the data and it works. So amazing, right? So now how do we actually translate this into something that's actually visible for users, right? Because obviously what we want to do is actually do something with this, right? So let's go ahead and create a table which can show us the customer data. So how do we do that? So let's go ahead and do a const table equals document.create element. So if you remember, create element allows us to create HTML elements, right? And then we'll do something called, we'll create a table row, right? Equals document.create element tr, right? TR stands for table row, okay? And so the first part of a table, right? So if we go back to how a table is in HTML, table HTML, let's look at this, right? You'll see it has a th, right? A table row, right? And then a heading. Okay, so it has a th. So what we can do here is we can actually create those table headings. So we can call it const table heading first name equals document dot create element th. Okay, and then table heading first name dot inner HTML equals first name. And so we're going to do this for first name, last name, and state, right? So let's go ahead, copy off this logic here. And so we'll call this table heading last name, right? And here we'll do last name, and then table heading state. Okay. And here we will do table heading state dot inner HTML equals state. Easy enough, right? Super nice. Okay, cool. So now we have a table row, and the table headings, right? And so what we can do here is we can first do a table row dot append child and append each of these, right? Because that's also very important, right? And remember, the order matters here. So the order you append them will be the order they show up. So make sure to order them the way you want to make them appear. Okay, perfect, great. And now we can do a table dot append child table row. Perfect, that's it. So now we have a table. So now let's go back to our example and see what we have, see if it looks any different. Okay, nothing yet, and that's probably because we're not appending this anywhere. It just exists. Okay, so what we can do here is we can actually just do something and say document.body, right? So we can do document.body.append child table. Okay, and let's go back here, see how it looks. All right, cool. Looks pretty good, right? So now, of course, we have to actually add data to the table, right? Which is very important. So adding data to table. Okay, and I don't know why it's such a big gap, but we'll fix that. Okay, and so here what we can do is now take that JSON, right, and iterate through it, right? So we can do a for each. Okay, and here we let's say for each customer, right, because each customer is what shows up there. And here what we can do is actually go ahead and create table rows, right? Again, more table rows. So we'll do const customer table row equals document.create element tr. Okay. And now, of course, what we're going to have to do is create a table data for each single one of those. So what we can do is we can actually take const customer table first name equals document.create element td. Okay, and we're going to do the same for last name and state. Okay, so make sure to do those, last name, and make sure to do the same for state. Okay, cool. And then what we're going to do is, if we look at the data, right, we see that it's going to be, see if I can open this up here a little bit. Maybe I have to refresh. Okay, so here we can see it's going to be customer underscore first name, customer underscore last name, customer underscore state, right? So what we're going to have to do is say customer table first name dot inner HTML equal to customer dot or customer at customer underscore first underscore name, right? And do the same for last name and for state. Okay, so we'll do last name here and do state, and we have to make sure that when we're doing this we update this to be last name, update this to be state. Okay, cool. And then we have to make sure to append these, right? So customer table row dot append child customer table first name, right? And make sure to do that for all 3 rows. So customer table last name, customer table state. Perfect, right? And then do not forget this. We have to append this to the table. Append child, customer table row. All right, so now this is pretty exciting. But if we look at this, I hope, and we refresh here, look at that. That is so cool. We can actually see our data. It's unbelievable, right? We can actually see our data. Now, obviously, we haven't deployed this yet, which we will in a second, right? So let's go ahead and deploy this. So how do we deploy this? So let's quit this, do a git status, git add, git commit, dash m, say feat, maybe adding new HTML page. Do a git push, okay? And so now, if everything goes well, this will be hosted on a real website in just a few minutes, right? So let's go ahead. We can see now it is building. So it's going to take probably 5 seconds. It's going to build that new HTML page. And refresh. And let's look at this. Ready, steady, get. Oh, what? It's not working. You can maybe notice the hint of sarcasm in my voice, but I did know it was going to work. It wasn't going to work. But let's take a look at why. So this is very confusing, right? It's just blank, right? So let's go to the network tab, refresh our page, and see, I see a failure. I wonder what that is. So if you notice something here, the URL says that we are looking at localhost 3000, okay? That's the problem, right? Because now we are not in localhost. We are in our own app, right? In our website. So how do we solve that, right? Like, obviously, we won't be using localhost anymore. So all you have to do is just get rid of this and just do /customers, right? And you can test this locally, of course. Just do an npm start, right? And go to localhost 3000 and refresh, and it still works. So that's it. All we have to do is do a /customers, right? Get rid of the localhost 3000 because now it's just assuming that, oh, since I'm doing a /customers, I'm assuming that it's part of the current domain, which is accurate. So that's it. So now all we have to do is now again do a git status, git add dot, git commit dash m, chore, fixing URL, and git push. Okay, cool. So now let's go here, make sure that this all loads as expected. It is loading. All right, looks like still loading, fixing URL, right? So it's going to take a second. Let it take a second. That's not a problem. All right, and it just went up, and now we refresh our page. And look at that. That is so cool. So now on our real deployed app, if all of you go to this app right now, you'll see this and some more stuff, but we'll talk about that in a second. That's pretty cool, right? You can't deny it. Don't deny it, right? That's pretty cool. So if you actually go to this is your real website and it's usable, right? That's pretty cool. So, okay, now we've just gotten started, right? There's still some more stuff that I want to cover, right? So this is really exciting, right? So now, cool, we have our customer data, great. But now, what if I want a user to add a customer, right? I mean, obviously, I'd want them to do that at some point as well, right? So what I did is I went back to my local machine, started up the server again, and now I'm thinking, we should have a way for a user to add a customer. So let's go ahead and create a form. Right, so we'll go ahead, create a form here, and here we'll have a H1, call it maybe our customers, right? Our customers, right? And on here we'll have a form, right? And in this form it'll be super simple. It'll have first name, last name, and state, right? So let's go ahead and create that. So we'll do a label for equals first name, right? And do first name, right? And then we'll do a input type equals text, and we'll do ID equals first name, right? And then we'll do a BR, and we'll do all the same for last name and state. And here for state, we'll also add a max length of 2, right? Otherwise you'll be able to enter in anything, so cool. And we'll add one more BR, and then we'll have a input type equals submit, and name equals add customer. Okay, cool. Pretty exciting. All right, make sure to close out this. All right, so this is super cool, right? But now, obviously, we have to do some more stuff, right? Obviously, this form is great, but it needs to submit something, right? It needs to actually call a function, right? So let's go ahead, go to our index.js and actually, or sorry, not customers.js, and we're going to create another function, and it's going to be called, are you ready for it? Create customer. Shocking, I know. Who would have guessed that I would name something so obviously, but I spelled async wrong. Okay, so this will just call our customer post, right, that we created, right, in our index.js, right? It'll just call this post, right? So super easy. So how do we do that? Well, should be easy enough. Let's just have a await fetch, right? And it'll be to /customer, right? And here we'll have a JSON, and that will say method colon post, right, comma, and it'll have a body, right? And that body will have a JSON dot stringify, and we will stringify first name colon, and let's just set up everything first, and then we'll actually get the data, colon, comma, state, comma, colon. Okay, perfect. And here what we'll do is we will also get the first name. So how do we get the first name? Well, here I'm using backticks, right? Notably, right? Not single quotes, backticks. And we're going to do a $sign and say document dot get element by ID and do first name, right? Because that's what we call the thing. Perfect. Dot value. Okay, and we're going to do the same for last name and state, right? And so that's going to get it straight from the form, right? So we won't have to worry about anything. It'll be super easy, nice and chill, and we'll be good. Okay, perfect. All right, let's go ahead and test this. All right, so that's pretty cool. I mean, that's easy enough, right? So let's go ahead and go to our local. Okay, sorry about that. So we're going to go to our local, and here we'll put mul dash, let's say, actually, let's do something else. Let's do John Doe or John Smith, and we'll say he's from TN, Tennessee, right? Submit. Okay. Interesting. Didn't work. Maybe I put something wrong. That's a possibility. Or I'm very stupid and I forgot something. If we go to the customers.html, I forgot the onSubmit. Whoopsie. So let's do that, right? So let's add onSubmit. OnSubmit equals create customer, right? And make sure to return false, right? Otherwise it'll force the page to refresh, and we don't want that, right? Yeah, I don't think we want that. So actually, let's see what happens if we do keep it. Let's see. Okay, cool. So let's do John Smith TN. Okay, submit. Okay, interesting. I don't see John Smith here, and let's see what happened here. Customers. I don't see the post call being made, so there's clearly a problem. OnSubmit equals create customer. Let's do a return false for now. I think this might make a difference, so let's see. Let's do a Jim Jones from Arizona. Okay, so now we're getting a 500. Why? Okay, let's take a look at why. We're getting a 500. We don't know why. Let's take a look at our logs, right? So cannot read properties of undefined reading first name. Okay, so it looks like, if we go to our body here, it looks like first name doesn't exist. Why? Why does first name not exist? Looks like it does to me. Okay. But that is what it's saying. Adding customer request undefined cannot read properties of undefined reading first name. Okay, let's check something. So let's go here, go to our payload and see, okay, I see first name, I see last name, I see state. Preview and go to our headers. That looks good to me. Let's double check that everything looks good here. First name, last name, state. Yeah, looks good to me. I mean, I see everything that I expect. First name, last name, state. Yes, that looks good to me. Okay, so it's saying request undefined type error cannot read properties of undefined reading first name. So it's saying that if you go here, basically it's trying to parse first name and it doesn't exist. Now, obviously we do not believe that to be true because it is working, but I have a theory. So I think the data is not being sent as an application JSON, right? So I think we have to go headers. I think we have to add a header here and do content dash type and do colon application slash JSON. I think that matters. So let's try this again. So we'll do John Smith, Arizona. Okay. I'm seeing issue here. 500. Cannot read properties of undefined reading first name. So now it's saying, hey, first name still doesn't exist, which is very odd because first name clearly exists. I mean, okay, let's check something. So if we go to the payload, first name, last name. Okay, it looks good to me. I don't see any issues here. First name, last name, state. Yeah, body slash customer. Yeah, I mean, it looks good to me. All right, give me a second. I'll be right back. All right, I made a very dumb mistake. So we made an API change, but we forgot to refresh the page. This is my reaction right now. Okay, I refreshed the page. It's working now. So let's go ahead, add John Doe from Arizona and click submit. Okay, cool. Added, right? But where's the data? So we technically added it, but I don't see it on this page. Why is that? Well, maybe we have to refresh the page. Aha! Now I see John Doe. Okay, so that's interesting. So we have this interesting issue where we're seeing, oh, you know, like, great. I mean, like, the data's there. We just need to refresh the table. That should be easy enough, right? So all we would have to do is call the load customer data function again, right? So await load customer data, right? That's it, right? Because then it'll just call this again and create the table again. Easy enough, right? Let's go ahead. That seems easy enough. So Jane Doe from Rhode Island. Click submit. Oh, sorry, forgot to refresh. You have to refresh. Sorry. So let's call it Jane Jones from Wyoming, right? Submit. Okay, that's not exactly what I wanted, but it's doing something. So it's creating a brand new table, which is interesting. So what do we do? So that's an interesting question. So what we could do is say, hey, what if the table, if it already exists, just delete it, right? Maybe we can do that, right? So how do we do that? Well, what we could do is when we create the table, we do a table dot set attribute and we add an ID. So this actually allows you to set the table to have an ID, right? And then what we can do is before we append the table, right? So here, before we append the table, right? What we can do is we can say, hey, we can say const pre-existing table equals document dot get element by ID customer info, right? And say, hey, if there is a pre-existing table, right? Then just remove it. So there's this remove function we can leverage, right? And there's this remove HTML function. And you can see that. There you go. Cool. So you can just remove any element. So nice and easy. And then it just appends a new table. So now if I'm right, and we go here and we say Jane Smith from Maryland, look at that. That is pretty cool. That is a fully functional website if I know one. All right, so now let's go ahead. Let's commit this code. But before that, I'm seeing some error here. Let's just see if we can install that. Error, HTTP header sent, cannot set headers after they are sent to the client. Let's go to our index.js and see what's going on here. So if we look here in our, this looks to be in the adding customer one, right? So let's go to our adding customer and see what we did. Okay, if return else res.send res.header is set here. It's only if there's an error. This must have been if there's an error, so okay, we can ignore that. All right, so let's go ahead, go here and do a git status, git add, git commit -m, feat adding feature to add customers, git push. Okay, now this is a very exciting time. So now we're going to go to Vercel, and if everything works out well, it's building now, so let it build, right? Take like 30 seconds. Vercel is very fast, by the way, so I wish we could use it at actual work because our pipelines are unbelievably slow. But okay, cool. So now we go here to our link. And one thing to note is you'll always see two links. There's a deployment and a domains link. Anytime you submit code, make sure to use the domains link, not the deployment link. So just as a heads up. So let's go here and look at that. That is, oh, so cool. So let's just say Maryland and look at that. Oh, this is too much fun. Okay, this is so cool. This is a real website. This is actually usable today if you go and use it, right? I'll post this link as well, so please go ahead, try it. Please don't like try to like max out my quota. I would really appreciate that. But yeah, this is super cool. All right. So this is all I had. Super, super exciting, right? I mean, this is like the full stack app. I mean, this is end to end, right? This is something you can go on your resume, put, and this really actually is something you've done, right? And you can go and build this, and for your group project, what you're building, this is it, right? You're going to be building a full stack app. Hopefully it looks a lot better than this, but this is super exciting, right? So, this is all I had. Thank you all. This is going to be, obviously, I think there's some, like, this is fun. This is not needed for assignment 2, to be clear, but this is really useful because for the project you need this. So just keep that in mind. So with that, that is all I had. Thank you all. I will see you all next time. And all right.